This is November 2015, standard level, paper 1, question 5. It's a question all about functions. About inverse functions, a fairly straightforward question about inverse functions, and a slightly more complicated, a slightly less routine question about composite functions. So part A. We're starting with the function f of x equals x minus 5 cubed, and we're trying to find its inverse. Now, the first thing I want to say before I start doing this is you don't want to expand this. The reason for that is in a second, that says expand. The reason for that is in a second I'm going to try and isolate x. So it's much easier to isolate x if x only appears once. If you expand x minus 5 cubed out, you'll have x cubed appearing, x squared appearing, and an x term appearing. You'll have 3 appearances of x. And it's much harder, well, it's basically impossible to isolate x if you've got it appearing 3 times without turning it back into a situation where x appears once. So let's start with x minus 5 cubed. How am I going to isolate x? Well, the first thing to undo is undo the cubing. So undo the cubing by cube rooting both sides, and you get the cube root of y is equal to x minus 5, and then add 5 to both sides, and we've managed to isolate x. X is equal to the cube root of y plus 5. Last step is to write down f inverse of x is equal to the cube root of not y, because we're supposed to swap over x and y at the end, so the cube root of x plus 5. And that's your 3 marks. First one comes from here, from beginning the manipulation correctly. The second one comes, and there's always a mark for this in these inverse function questions. If you rearrange, if you swap the x and the y over at the end, then even if you've done everything else wrong, or swap them over at the beginning, doesn't matter when you do it, as long as you swap the x and the y over, there's a method mark available and an accuracy mark available for getting the right final answer. Okay, part B. Let g be a function so that f of g of x is equal to 8x to the 6. F of g of x is equal to 8x to the 6. And we know that f of x is equal to x minus 5 cubed. That was in the question originally. Just write it out again so we've got it all here ready to go. Now there are 2 ways to do this. You can actually use your result from part 1. That's sort of part A even. That's sort of a bit abstract though. So I'm going to do it like this. F of g of x means that g is substituted into f. So instead of writing f of x is equal to x minus 5, I'm going to replace the x with the function g to give me this. G of x minus 5 cubed is equal to this thing here, the 8x to the 6. 8x to the 6. And now I'm basically undoing the steps the same as I did before, but now instead of isolating x, I'm going to isolate g. I want to get that on its own to find out what function it was. It's exactly the same steps. I'm going to cube root both sides. and I get g of x minus 5 is equal to, well, this time I can do the cube root. So it's the cube root of 8x to the 6. The cube root of 8 is 2. And the cube root of x to the 6 is x squared. Nearly done. Should be fairly obvious how we're going to isolate g of x now. I add 5 to both sides, and I get g of x is equal to 2x squared plus 5.